Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Subir, and I direct events here at the Strand. Before we launch into a discussion of Stephen Graham Jones and Paul Tremblay's new book, I'd like to share a little bit of history about the Strand. The Strand was founded in 1927 by Benjamin Bass over on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled until, after 93 years, the Strand is the sole survivor, still run by the Bass family, now by third generation owner Nancy Bass Wyden, still selling new and used books. We want to thank all of you for your support. Without our loyal community of book lovers, authors like Stephen and Paul, we wouldn't be here today, and we are so very appreciative. So tonight we are excited to have with us Stephen Graham Jones and Paul Tremblay. Stephen is the recipient of an NEA Fellowship, the Texas Institute of Letters Award for Fiction, the Independent Publishers Award for Multicultural Fiction, a Bram Stoker Award, or This Is Horror Awards, and he's been a finalist for the Shirley Jackson Award and the World Fantasy. By day, he is the Ivana Baldwin Professor of English at the University of Colorado Boulder. Paul Tremblay has won the Bram Stoker, British Fantasy, and Massachusetts Book Awards and is the author of The Cabin at the End of the World, Disappearance at Devil's Rock, A Head Full of Ghosts, the crime novels Little Sleep, and No Sleep Till Wonderland, and the short story collection Growing Things and Other Stories. Moderating tonight's event is the Strand's own Senior Communications Associate, Andrea Klinker. You may know her from our Facebook Live author interview. So just to walk you through the format of the event, we're going to begin with a reading by Paul, then go into a reading by Stephen, then go into a discussion moderated by Andrea, and end with an audience Q&A. So if you have any questions, please think of them, drop them in the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen or in the Facebook comment thread. And so with that, please join me in welcoming welcoming Paul to the stage.
Hello, everybody. Hope you're doing all right. So I'm just going to jump in. This is in the opening of my novel, Survivor Song. So all you need to know before I read this is that Natalie is 8.5 months pregnant. She's at home alone, waiting for her husband, Paul, no relation to me, to come back from the grocery store, which is now for everybody become the scariest place in the world. He comes back. They're now having a conversation as they're bringing in the groceries, in this time of quarantine. What Paul says next is an echo of a conversation from 10 days ago. We should have driven to your parents' place as soon as it started getting bad. We should go now. Natalie says, Paul, we can't. Why not? We're under federal quarantine. They won't let us leave. We need to try. So are we going to drive down 95 into Rhode Island just like that? Natalie isn't arguing with him. She really isn't. She agrees they are indeed in big trouble and they can't stay. She doesn't want to stay, and she doesn't want to go to an emergency shelter or an overburdened hospital. She's arguing with Paul in the hope one of them will stumble upon a solution. We can't stay here, Natalie. We have to try something. She says, what if they arrest us? We might get separated. You were just telling me how crazy it was at Star Market. Do you think it's any better on the highways or at the state borders? We'll find some open back roads. Natalie nods, but says, maybe we're at the worst point now. I didn't even tell you there was a fox staggering in the middle of Washington Corner intersection like it was drunk, and it fucking dove right at my front tire. Natalie says, the quarantine will help get the spread of the illness under control. Everyone will be all right as long as we don't. Natalie continues talking, even though there's the unmistakable sound of footsteps on their gravel driveway. She's lived in the house long enough to know the difference between the sustained crunch and mash of car tires, the light maraca-like patter of squirrels and cats, the allegro rush of paws from the neighbor's dog, a goofy Rhodesian ridgeback the size of a small horse, and the percussive gait of a person. The steps are hurried, quickly approaching the house, yet the rhythm is all wrong. The rhythm is broken. There's a grinding lunge, a lurch, 2 heavy steps, then a hitching correction, and a stagger, and a drag. Someone or something crashes into the propped open gate and bellows out 3 loud barks. After the initial shock, Natalie all but melts with relief, believing what she hears is in fact Casey the dog. But shock turns to worry. She wonders why Casey would be out on her own. Natalie turns and she cranes her head and looks out the front door and through the porch. A large upright blur passes by the small row of screened windows. The barks return, and they are more like expectorating coughs. There was a man standing less than 10 feet away from her. He opens the screen door and says in a dry, scratchy, but clear baritone, "Fall came and it began to rain, left out in the cold and rain." Then he grunts. Natalie and Paul yell at the man to go away. They shout questions and directions to each other. The white man is large, over 6 feet tall and closer to 300 pounds than he is 200. He wears dirty jeans and a long-sleeved t-shirt advertising a local brewery. He steps through the door and fills their porch. With each coughing bark, he bends and contorts, and then his body snaps back into an unnatural rigidity. He points and reaches toward Natalie and Paul. Natalie can only see the shape and contour of the man's face as he's silhouetted by the dim daylight behind him. Natalie's fear morphs into a self-preservation shade of rage. Her fists clench and she steps forward and yells, "Get the fuck off our porch!" Paul moves more nimbly and darts in front of Natalie. He swings the front door shut with enough force to rattle the frame and wall. His hand momentarily loses contact with the doorknob, and he is not able to get the door locked before the man is already forcing it back open. "Natalie!" Paul shouts her name as though it's a question that is not rhetorical yet has no answer. The door swings open, forcing Paul back into the house. The bottoms of his sneakers squeak as they slide over the wooden floor. Paul bends his legs, lowers a shoulder, attempting to gain purchase, to find the leverage he has lost forever. His feet stop sliding and they tangle, tripping him up. Paul falls onto his knees and the fiberglass door sweeps him away. Poor Paul. So next is my good friend and genius writer, Stephen Graham Jones, reading from his new novel.
Hello. I should cede my time so Paul can read the rest of the novel to us. But my publicist will probably come through the screen and punch me. So how about I read the very last 2 pages of the novel? Would that be great? No, I'll read from the first section, The House That Ran Red. And I got to get my specs for this. All right. This is Friday. The chapters early on are all weekday names. I was trying to be like The Shining, Anyways, Lewis is standing in the vaulted living room of his and Peta's new rent house, staring straight up at the spotlight over the mantel, daring it to flicker on now that he's looking at it. So far, it only comes on with its thready glow at completely random times, maybe in relation to some arcane and unlikely combination of light switches in the house. Or maybe from the iron being plugged into a kitchen socket while the clock upstairs isn't or is plugged in. And don't even get him started on all the possibilities between the garage door and the freezer and the floodlights aimed down at the driveway. It's a mystery is what it is. But more important, it's a mystery he's going to solve as a surprise for Peta, and in the time it takes her to drive down to the grocery store and back for dinner. Outside, Harley, Lewis's Malamutant, is barking steady and pitiful from being tied to the laundry line, but the barks are already getting hoarse. He'll give it up soon enough, Lewis knows. Unhooking his collar now would be the dog training him instead of the other way around. Not that Harley's young enough to be trained anymore, but not like Lewis is either. Really, Lewis imagines, he deserves some big Indian award for having made it to 36 without pulling into the drive-thru for burger and fries, easing away with diabetes and high blood pressure and leukemia. And he gets the rest of the trophies for having avoided all the car crashes and jail time and alcoholism on his cultural dance card. Or maybe the reward for lucking through all that, meth too, he guesses, is having been married 10 years now to Peta, who doesn't have to put up with motorcycle parts soaking in the sink, with the drips of Wolf brand chili he always leaves between the coffee table and the couch, with the tribal junk he always tries to sneak up onto the walls of their next house. Like he's been doing for years, he imagines the headline on the Glacier Reporter back home. Former basketball star can't even hang graduation blanket and own home. Never mind that it's not because Peta draws the line at full-size blankets, but more because he used it for padding around a free dishwasher he was bringing home a couple of years ago, and the dishwasher tumped over in the bed of the truck on the very last turn, spilled clotted, rancid gunk directly into Hudson's Bay. Also, never mind that he wasn't exactly a basketball star half a lifetime ago. It's not like anybody but him reads this mental newspaper. And tomorrow's headline, The Indian Who Climbed Too High, full story on 12B, which is to say, that spotlight in the ceiling's not coming down to him, so he's gonna have to go up to it. Thank you.
Yay! That was a really wonderful way to start everything. First of all, welcome both of you. Thank you for doing those readings. That was wonderful.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, of course. I wanted to start with what may or may not be obvious, but how do you two horror and thriller writers know each other?
Paul, you're probably better at telling that story, man.
Well, I mean, part of it to start off, I read Stephen's Demon Theory in like 2007. When did that novel come out, Stephen? Came out a few years before that, right?
I think it was 06, this novel.
Yeah, so a friend recommended it to me. I read it and loved it. And I don't know, like, as I still typically do, like, I just reached out to him. Like, I sent him an email. It's like, hey, I really loved your book. And he had happened to read some of my short stories online. And so he was like, hey, I like some of your short stories. So we just sort of struck up a conversation that way. And since then, geez, I guess it's what, 13 years plus now, we did a bunch of conventions and stuff together.
Yeah, and we kind of watched our kids grow up together too, which has been really neat.
Yeah.
And Paul helps me every year with my grades because I always have these great ideas that I can do math at the end of the semester, but I never can. And Paul always has to save my life.
It's nice to have backup like that, especially when it's coming.
Yeah. And I think after reading Paul's stories, the first novel or novella of his I read, it's kind of on the line between, right, is the Harlequin and the Train.
Oh, right, yeah.
Yeah, and it blew me away. He does a thing with the numbering of the chapters, which I've never seen anybody else do before or since. And I want so badly to steal it, but I've got to like somehow erase Paul from the scene if I'm going to do that.
No, take it. You can do it, please.
It's like a form of flattery, right?
Yeah, absolutely. No, please.
I mean,
I borrow stuff all the time.
Yeah, but like if I wear somebody else's skin, that stops being flattery,
Yes.
Yes. Paul, I want to jump back to you since you are our first reader for the evening. And I want to know a little bit of like the timeline of how your story came together, because the way it relates to what we are in now is like gives you a little anxiety beyond what the actual story is. So just like how did you when were you writing your story and how did you get to it? And then and now it's happening. So
sure. So like the original sort of what if that it grew out of happens in July of 2018. And I'm almost embarrassed to admit that it was a moment of like professional like panic because this book was going to be the last book of my deal and I hadn't started another book yet. And I only had a year left to write it. And for me, I mean, that's pushing the timeline for me. So I was actually, the first time I had ever left the country, I was in England. My British publisher had sent me over, which was, so nice of them. And I was on a train, like literally like, oh crap, what am I going to do for this next book? I really need to start. So like with some of my recent novels, I typically maybe start with the trope sometimes. Like I started with Home Invasion for the Cabin at the End of the World. So I wrote down zombie and I kind of was like, there's so many zombie novels. And then I had a what if that I can't say because it ruins the book. So I wrote the book from July 2018 and finished the draft I turned into my publisher in August 2019. In the in-between, I think a lot of what people find like really quote unquote prescient about what's going on is for the medical research, I relied on my sister because I hate research. Like Stephen hates to do math. I hate research. I wish I could make it all up and I can't. But luckily this time it was fun because I got to do it with my sister, who's one of my best friends. And she lives like 15 minutes down the road from me. She's a nurse at one of the biggest hospitals in Boston. And so she got me like her hospital's emergency plans. But then the biggest thing that ended up getting put into the novel was in 2014, there was an Ebola outbreak, obviously in Africa, but we had some patients in the US as well. And I think we had one or two in Massachusetts. So like my sister's hospital was like, hey, we're going to take Ebola patients. And the first plans that they sent the nurses were lacking, shall we say. They sent like a PDF and a 15-minute PowerPoint. And within those, like they talked about, they weren't probably going to have hazmat suits. That was the first time I heard of PPE as an acronym. Luckily, there was no flood of Ebola patients, and also I think the hospital came to their senses and set a better plan. But all that stuff got put into the book. In the book, there's a text exchange between Romola and some of her coworkers, and that text exchange is essentially the text my sister and her coworkers sent after they had read the PDF and saw the PowerPoint. And I was always struck by, their dark humor, their anger, but also at the very end, them saying, "Yeah, I'll still go into work tomorrow," which always struck me. So, yeah, so all credit, unfortunately, goes to her, because now, that was a preview for what she had to go through, 1,000 times worse, this spring.
Yeah, that is a very big part of it. Like the medical procedures, like how, because I feel like in a lot of similar topics of like horror and thriller, where it's like there's some sort of like infectious disease that's spreading fast, or some kind of like invasion of some sort, you just get like the person-to-person interactions. You don't always see like what's medical staff doing, what's the government doing, what's the military doing. It's more of a personal story. So that was very interesting to read about that perspective, which I don't think we've gotten a lot of before.
Yeah, I mean, that was definitely purposeful. I knew I didn't want to do because so many people have done it better already with like the cast of thousands, the big government response, the CDC. So I really wanted, the quieter story. There's essentially two main characters: Natalie, who you met in the introduction, and her best friend Romola, who's a pediatrician. So the main part of the book really only follows like 4 to 6 hours of that day, which includes a trip to the hospital. And I don't know, like I'm always more interested in the personal stuff. I like having the smaller personal story with the wider maelstrom going on around them.
Yeah.
I don't know, because I feel like that always gets to me. That's what I'm afraid of, is like, what would I do? Not what would me as a cast of thousands do, but like that story stayed with me for 4 to 6 hours. Although I found out in March that my story would be me in a fetal position on the couch watching Animal Planet.
It goes down good that way.
Yeah.
That's awesome. And also to everyone who's watching, I will do my best, and we'll do our best not to give any spoilers, so that you can still enjoy the book if you haven't got either book, if you haven't got through or started either of them. But I wanted to bring up a line that reoccurs. I don't think gives too much away. But this is not a fairy tale; it is a song, which I have a lot about my own ideas about. But how did that come about?
They're probably all better than mine. For me, like I'm such like a music nerd, and honestly, if I had my druthers, if I had a time machine, if I could go back and make myself like a good punk or metal guitarist, musician, I would trade that in a heartbeat. So I always go to music for inspiration. And my favorite songs tend to be short, loud, fast, but also sort of like both like also like melancholy and weirdly hopeful in a way. So that was sort of the vibe I wanted to go for, like this short, fast novel. And I don't know, all the best songs usually have like a little tinge of sadness to it. So when I'm like comparing it to a fairy tale, there's sort of the modern fairy tale, like Frozen, where everybody's happy. But then there's sort of the origin of, at least the European origin of those Grimm's fairy tales are so dark. So when I'm saying that, like part of me is saying, this is not like a Disney story, but I'm sort of winking because I make a ton of references to Grimm's fairy tales throughout the book. It's not really a spoiler, but I think it's like a fun little thing. Like when the people in the book are fully succumb to the rabies virus, they speak gibberish, but the gibberish is actually lines from Grimm's fairy tales.
I was going to ask about that, actually.
Oh, very good. Yeah. No, I had something like I don't think people would pick up. That's just something I do to entertain myself.
This one's for me. Yeah.
Doesn't David Bowie have a line from one of his songs? This isn't a blank, it's a blank. What do y'all remember that? I know that rhythm, but I can't remember what you fill in. Probably somebody in the chat knows what it is. I don't remember what the terms are, but it's really cool when he says it in that song. So I'm just useless. Yeah, somebody I know.
No, that's great. And I that now that you say it, like that rhythm of like every time you think it's going to slow down and there'll be some resolve, but they'll find some help, like something else happens, and that is such like a punk fast rhythm to a story. That's cool. I like that.
I will say, I will say Stephen read a super early version of it, and I really tried to force like a song structure into everything. Like I even started naming some of the chapters like first verse or something. And Steve was like, don't force the music thing, which he was right. So one of the things I did keep though is, prelude, the prelude, interlude, and postlude. Those are the names of parts of songs.
Yeah.
As usual, Stephen helps me out.
Well,
Stephen, do you have anything you want to ask Paul about Survivor Song?
I would ask him what T-shirt is he wearing.
Well, yeah, T-shirt, please.
It's a Mongrels T-shirt.
Let me see first. I'm wearing like a button-down shirt that's got all sorts of like horror stuff on it. But this is a Mongrels T-shirt. Stephen's 2016 novel.
2016, yeah.
2016 werewolf novel. Yeah, it's a cool T-shirt. I've worn it so much. I don't know if you can see. It's getting like worn out, like the decal.
Yeah. The art is by Fig Bar Lonesome. He's good. He did good stuff. I've probably in email interchanges, I think I've asked Paul if I ask him anything else, it'll be fake because I'll be asking him the same thing I asked him. Maybe one thing I wondered though, Romola Rams. Have you known somebody with the name? I've never known anybody with the name. I like it.
Partly to honor my sister. One of her best friends in college was Romola. They called her Rammy though, so I didn't want to go that far. So I called her Rams. And actually, I think Natalie's personality is more the real life Romola. She was like outgoing, kind of like crazy party person. Whereas the Romola in this book is a lot more even keeled.
Yeah, she is. She's a control. You had that Paul who was, of course, infected. And of course, there's a variety of names you could have used that aren't Paul, but you used Paul. But it's still not you. Did it feel weird to have your name attached to somebody like that who's sick, or is that your way of like showing that this person who is possibly the writer is going to be erased from the story now going forward? I don't know.
I'd like to say it's more that because it sounds more high-minded, but Stephen and my good friend Laird Barron, who's a horror and crime writer, used to tell me all the time about like he'd write something really like gruesome in a story. He said he would like laugh out loud. And to me, this was like the only time I felt like I laughed out loud was naming the husband Paul who gets killed terribly. But I have had to point out to a few people he's described as being 5'10" in the novel, and I am 6'4", so he's clearly not me. I'm quite proud of my 6'4".
Yeah, Paul's a bump taller than me, man. I always try to stand tall when I'm around Paul. But also, Paul and I smuggled Laird into one of our novels, right? Yeah.
Oh yeah, they've been into a bunch. Or Laird's definitely been in a few things.
Yeah.
And Stephen, really quickly, I guess if we segue over to him, Stephen was a math tutor in A Head Full of Ghosts.
Yeah.
Which that was probably another moment I laughed to myself because like I know Stephen hated math, and I described him as being like being really nebbish and awkward.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it makes me sound like I only hated math in return because I think math hated me first.
Fair.
Yeah. I really like that little nods to each other. Like, I always I'm writing everyone types now. Anyways, let us continue that segue to you, Stephen, and talk a little bit more about the Only Good Indians. And I actually want to start with the title itself, which we learned kind of early in the book is an insult. So I wanted to get your perspective on using that, and if you're looking to kind of shift the way that phrase is looked at.
I am. I'm trying to undercut it all I can, of course. I guess it's attributed to Theodore Roosevelt, right? Or maybe Sheridan. Like, nobody's totally sure who said it. But yeah, the only good Indian is a dead Indian. I, of course, have issues with that, And people in the novel are pushing back against it. And so I just wanted to have, all the characters in here interrogate, for themselves anyways, what it means to be a good Indian in today's world, because the world at large wants us to wear loincloths and still be in the 19th century, and it's hard to, as an Indian in today's world, it's hard not to internalize some of that, you feel like I need to live up to this. I need to be like a good hunter or something. I need to fit those 19th century expectations that are still being stilted onto us. So of course I wanted to push back against that. And it turns out, no surprise, there's not one way to be a good Indian. There's 7 million ways because there's 7 million of us, But I was nervous about using this title because, it's like, how to say it, like, Dave Chappelle, when he quit doing his show, The Chappelle Show, he tells that story about he was like in minstrel makeup and doing some act, a sketch, and everybody was laughing, but there was one guy in the crew who was laughing a little too much, and he felt weird. He felt weird about that. And in the same way, I wondered if I was giving license to people who really still subscribe to this notion of the only good Indian is a dead Indian. I wondered if I was giving them license to now say that with more freedom. So I was nervous about that. My editor, Joe Monty at Saga, he convinced me that the undercutting is more than worth one or two people who feel they now have license to say that,
Yeah, and there is such like an antiquated view of like who Indigenous people are. Like there's such a gap of like, so many people still think of like spaghetti westerns and John Wayne movies, and it's like that's not correct.
Yeah. But when I was when I was 17 and 18, going all around everywhere, I remember I used to wear a headband a lot, and I think I was doing that because Indians in John Wayne movies wore headbands. So you do kind of adopt some of the ridiculousness, But as I understand it, those actors in those extras in the John Wayne movies, they wore headbands not because their culture, because that was their dress for their culture. They did it because they were all wearing wigs, and the headbands keep the wigs on when you're riding a horse.
Did not know that. little history. I had no idea. So and in your book, I just lost my train of thought. Oh no.
It's all right.
I wrote down what I was going to say, and I got caught up in our conversation. There are 4 characters that we follow who had an incident, a hunting incident, and we catch up with them 10 years later, and there's like there's a vengeance coming after them for what they did. And I wanted to speak to you a little bit about like why was there 10 years that before anything happened for them?
I consider that like the accrual of slasher interest. The trick with slashers is like some prank or misdeed or trespass or crime is committed, and then usually years later, some spirit of vengeance or that wronged party rises to rebalance the scales of justice. There's a spirit of vengeance punishing something that happened a long time ago, and there's 2 reasons for it to be a long time ago, I think. One of them is that the guilty parties need to have thought they got away with it. It needs to be long enough in the past that they can think nothing's going to happen, and then something happens. The other reason is usually, like if they pulled somebody's pants down on the playground or something, which in the large scheme of things isn't terrible. It's terrible if it happens to you, of course, and you remember it, and it shaped your identity and everything. But it's not the same as cutting somebody's arm off, Anyways, so that slasher, that injured party, will take that injury inside themselves for the next X amount of years, 10 years, say, and like lick it like a piece of dust until it becomes this big pearl of rage, and it's like you make a deposit of $1 in 0 year, and then 10 years later, it's like $20, And so my way of thinking is that when the slasher comes back with a machete and just starts carving through people, that's actually that's a disproportionate response. It's not in keeping to the initial injury usually, but because there's been all that accrual of interest through the years, it feels right. That's my hope anyways. That's kind of how I see slashers play out.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah, it kind of makes you have a disproportionate sense of like what the punishment should be because time is like twisted it.
Well, also, like if somebody does pull your pants down on the playground, and then if that happens in 6th grade, and then all through high school, people make fun of you because you had your pants pulled down in elementary school, you're going to focus on that so much that it does become large in your rearview mirror. It becomes not a mote of dust anymore, but a big old snowball or something, something really big. And at least in the texture of your life, it becomes very big,
Yeah, very true. And we learned, again, trying not to spoil too much, the spirit or being or animal, however you interpret it as a reader, coming back for revenge is an elk, who throughout the story starts to have their own chapters. And I was wondering if you had a structure of when that elk had a presence in the novel, like when it came in.
Yeah, I mean, mostly it's about pacing. Whenever it can escalate things, then I would try to bring the elk perspective in, or the spirit of vengeance perspective in. But the real, I mean, that's probably why I placed it where I placed it. But as for why those sections, chapters, little pieces exist, it's because another vital component of slashers on screen, anyways, is that you always get slasher cam, which is looking through Michael Myers' mask, you know, or you hear the breathing and all that stuff. And you can't really replicate that on the page very well at all. Nothing realistic, or maybe somebody can who's more talented than I am, but I can't seem to do it in a good way. And so for me, the most effective way to indicate slasher cam was to jump around and look out of the eyes of the spirit of vengeance, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I like, yeah, it does kind of progress it in that like intensity whenever the elk appears. You're like, here we go.
Hope so. Yeah.
Also, for a reminder, everyone who's watching, we're going to take questions from you probably in the next few minutes or so. So if you have them, just use that Q&A button at the bottom of the chat, or put them in the Facebook comments, and we'll get to them shortly. But I'll continue for now because I have lots of questions. I saw actually, and this is probably more of just an interesting tidbit than anything, the audiobook for The Only Good Indians is being read by Sean Taylor Corbett, who is also a Blackfeet Indian.
Yeah, no, it's amazing.
I think that's really interesting. And
yeah, it's really cool because Sean and I know the same places around the reservation around Montana, you know, and we had a lot of talks before he did that recording about who would speak with this accent, who would have that attitude and everything. And I've actually listened to the audiobook. I don't always listen to my audiobooks, but this one I did because I wanted to hear the cool job Sean did, and he really took it all the way. He did really, really well. I'm so impressed. And it's the first one of my novels that's been read by a Blackfeet. I like that a lot.
Yeah, I thought that was really important and like representative. I see that happening more with audiobooks. I was really glad to see it with this novel as well.
It'd be weird with a novel like John Gardner's Grendel, where it's a monster. You know, I don't know how you get a monster.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'd like to listen to a novel that's narrated by Tony the Tiger. I think that'd be neat. You know, he'd have a lot of exclamation points. You know,
he would. Everything is capital letters for him. The whole time. And I'm going to offer back to you, Paul, just the same as I did with Stephen. Do you have questions about that you'd like to share?
Yeah, similar. I feel like I've asked him everything, but a couple actually just really quickly occurred to me. I guess one's more than a statement. Well, actually, the first, I don't know if I know like what started you with like your love of slashers. Like, when the first time you saw one, was it like scarring, and then like you went back to it, or did you love it right away when you saw it? Or you tell me.
Yeah. What happened was, you know, growing up in where we did in Texas, or how we did, I guess I should say, we were always moving. Like the family in Mongrels who's always throwing their stuff in trash bags in the back of the car and going to the next town. That was us. We moved all the time. And sometimes just around houses in the county, sometimes to different cities. In 7th or 8th grade, I was living out in Wimberley, Texas, which is just outside Austin, a little bitty place back then. And I fell in with a group of people who had a big brother or big sister, or somehow we had some in with the video store. So every Friday after school, about 6 or 8 of us would leave the video store with a stack of probably 7 slashers: Jason, Freddy, Leatherface, Michael, and whatever other stuff was happening. But always a lot of Freddy and Jason for sure. And one of my friends, his house was out in the trees, and they had a disconnected garage, or that sounds like it was once connected, a garage that was a separate like thing, you know?
Yeah,
and
standalone.
Yeah, standalone, that's the word. Yeah. So, yeah, you should be here when I'm writing, Paul. I never can think of words, man. And his dad had put an old couch in there with a little like 19-inch TV, a tube TV, and a VCR. And so we would sit there for 6 movies and just scream and scream and scream with them and have so much fun. And then come about 2, 3 in the morning, his dad had a Freddy glove, and he would sneak out to the garage and he'd scratch it down the metal door of the garage. And that, no matter who we were, and we knew it was coming, it would still just terrify us to the core. We would dive off the couch, run out the side door of that garage, and just blast off through the darkness of the trees, just totally black. We were running for the creek. If we could run and jump in the creek, we'd be safe. I don't know why that is. Like, I don't know why slashers can't swim, you know, in our estimation. But
not with the glove anyway.
No, exactly. That's not any good. But or maybe Jason has like a little rebreather in this, you know. I don't know. But that sensation or that feeling of running through the blackness, laughing and screaming at the same time with tears running back from my eyes, to me, infected me and for the rest of my life, I guess. To me, that's what the slasher is. It's that bridge or that hybrid between a laugh and a scream. And that's specifically the feel I like about horror. But I never thought I was going to write slashers until 97 in January. I was working on my doctorate down in Tallahassee, Florida, and a friend came and knocked on my door and he said, "Hey man, I'm taking you to a movie." And I said the thing I always say, I'm writing, because I thought that was my job, was to write. I wasn't there to like hang out, I was there to write. And he said, "No, I'm taking you." And I said, "I'm writing." And we went back and forth a few times, and I finally saw that it was easier to go with him than it was to say no. So we got my jacket and went with him. Turned out it was Scream at the Dollars movie. And and that, my brain, I could feel like the folds in my brain just like all changing to Ghostface, you know. And I went back and saw it on my own the next 6 nights in a row, and I still read and watch Scream every 5 or 6 weeks. It's like my my gospel or something, you know. But yeah, so I guess slashers for me start in those two places, if I have to say where it starts. So.
Wow.
We have a lot of questions.
Okay.
That was a long.
I mean, you can continue if you want.
Let's go to your questions. Yeah.
Let's go to there. Yeah.
All right. Thank you everyone for submitting your questions. We'll try to get through as many as possible, but we don't want to rush. This is a great conversation. There's a few that are for each of you specifically, and some for both of you. So I'm going to start with you again, Paul. This is from Matt. He says, "As a co-chair of a medical ethics committee, I thought that the ethical dilemmas in Survivor Song, as in decisions made by Romola, and also the unethical choices made in The Only Good Indians, were very good choices to include in the stories. Have any philosophy peers of yours had any input on how they were presented or interesting reactions to them?"
I don't have any philosophy peers. Well, at this high school I teach at, they don't read my books. But no, thank you. I mean, for poor Romola, I mean, poor Natalie, obviously she's pregnant and infected. But I mean, I definitely gave Romola the most difficult questions to deal with. And I don't know, I mean, it certainly could be argued. And actually, Steve and I talked about this in terms of slasher. I don't know if he remembers, but we, I remember. He talked about the idea of transgression and justice later. But yeah, I mean, Romola is forced to make some pretty difficult questions and maybe some decisions, and some of the decisions she makes, I'm sure, are unethical and some people would have a problem with. But I don't know if that necessarily makes her like a bad person, in the moment. And that's, I'm always interested in that story of these, people we would consider like good people having to make impossible decisions. I mean, that's horror to me.
No, I totally agree with Paul. That's what horror is made of. At the end of the day, or the end of the experience, not the end, but in the middle of it, you have to make you have to see those good people making hard decisions. And I always think of it as, in horror, yet a character has to make a decision which somehow chips off a piece of their soul in order to get to the good daylight or whatever, And yeah, Romola definitely makes those hard decisions over and over, and it does make you ask yourself, what would I do in that situation? Which is good preparation for us in this crazy world we live in, of course. It's not easy to think about, because it makes you, I think good horror also tells you truths about yourself. And Paul's book does that for us, or it doesn't do it for us. It makes it happen in our heads. Like, the book is the trigger, and we have to think about what we would do. But as for philosophy friends, I guess, I have a philosophy degree, so I can be my own friend, right? Yeah. But yeah, in my book, the question I wanted to ask, which I hoped was a hard question, was, and I hope that everybody would feel it themselves. Like, we've all done things we regret. Like maybe I broke up with someone when I was a sophomore in high school that I shouldn't have, for no reason, like some Seinfeld show reason, like they eat their peas one at a time or something ridiculous like that, and maybe it hurt them And I shouldn't have done that, you know? And does that make me a bad person, or is that something that I can learn from and be a better person? And does that even matter if 10 years later that person comes for me with an axe, you know, and they might be justified? I don't know. I honestly don't have an answer to that kind of stuff, but I do like posing the question, you know?
Absolutely. Another question, kind of on the opposite end of that, can you discuss the use of humor in horror? In The Only Good Indian, there were many humorous moments, especially with the character whose daughter was a basketball player. Sorry for getting characters' names. That's from Rebecca.
Yeah, Denora is that daughter. No, well, humor in horror is completely necessary. Like when horror doesn't have little funny moments, and Paul does funny moments in his books as well, of course, then it doesn't strike me as a representation of the real world, because laughter is often how we deal with terrible situations, even lingering or just in the moment, whichever. We try to, that's how we let it make sense. We clothe it in comedy and humor. But as for mechanically how horror works in humor, the way I see it anyways, and I'm probably being specific to the slasher because that's where my heart is, like if things get scarier and scarier on a steep incline, as they have to in horror, then they quickly reach a plateau where it's just a shriek, and you just got to shriek for the rest of the novel or the rest of the movie or whatever. But what comedy does is it goes up for 10 minutes or 10 pages, then the joke allows you to reset, and then you go up again, and then you reset with a joke, and you go up again and reset with a joke. And I think that's how slashers specifically work. Like, as I understand it, physiologically, and your sister probably knows more about this than I do, Paul, physiologically, there's no difference in a laugh and a scream until the moment of eruption, you know? And I think horror really makes use of that. I love that feeling of, I don't know if I'm gonna laugh or I'm gonna scream, that indeterminacy. That's really pleasant to experience, I think.
Yeah, a great answer. I mean, I don't have too much to add, probably saying the same thing, but just with some slightly different words. But one thing, I mean, because to build to humor and to build to horror, I almost feel like it's almost the same process. Like you don't have to do the same build up to it. And when I first started writing, I didn't realize this until someone pointed out later. It was like, you know, all your short stories were horror, and my first attempts at longer fiction were like dark humor. And I kind of felt like I was writing them the same way. It just happened to be, I don't know, for whatever reason, my longest pieces were, you know, tended to be more on the humorous side. You know, it's just like there's two ways you can react to the world in horror, or you just have to laugh. I don't know, and I always think of, you know, Roy Scheider and Jaws. You know, we're going to need a bigger boat. It's like the ultimate existential horror joke moment. I mean, that's like life in a nutshell. You're going to need a bigger boat. You don't have one, no matter what. It's going to get you.
Yeah. Paul, can you show us your Jaws paraphernalia?
We're going to need a bigger boat.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That was perfect. Perfect drop. Oh. Kind of speaking to that, Jack on Facebook is asking for both of you, are there any horror tropes that you'd like to explore or invert in a novel at length that you haven't already?
You want to go, Paul? I went first last time.
I would love to write like a giant monster novel at some point. I've done monsters in like a bunch of short stories, but I've never been able to figure out, or at least be drawn to a way to do it at the novel length.
Do you mean like a giant thick novel or a kaiju giant monster?
Oh, like a large monster. Like a kaiju essentially. Yeah.
Important distinction.
Yeah. So I mean, every once in a while, like that sort of, you know, nags at the back of my head. It's like, oh, you're gonna write, you know, maybe that's the last thing I ever write, so maybe I'm putting it off. I don't know.
You know, I would also like to play around with the kaiju. My issue with the kaiju is always that, like, I understand there has to be a breeding population for there to be a kaiju eventually, and I'm like, how can we have like 700 King Kongs? You know, that because we would have seen that by now. You know, but the genre of horror that I always want to mess with, and I'm terrified to mess with at the same time, is the possession story, the possession novel. And also, now that Paul's got Head Full of Ghosts on the scene, I feel like everything I do is going to be like a minor version of that, you know? So I don't know, because he did it so well that it's like when Tolkien did Lord of the Rings. Like, I think fantasy writers felt kind of pinned in, like there's not room for us to move. He did it so completely, but I feel like Paul did the possession story so completely that I wonder what else I could do that might be close to new, you know?
Oh, thank you. You're too nice. And I don't know. I mean, it's fine. My brother's a huge werewolf fan. Like his email name used to be Lawrence Talbot at like Hotmail or something. You know, and I gave him mongrels. He's like, oh, when are you gonna do a werewolf book? I'm like, I can't. Like, I gave you the book. Like, I can't do a werewolf book.
Oh yeah.
Mahogany in the chat said, possession from the point of view of the possessed? ? Sounds interesting. But speaking also of your own works and what you want to explore, Lori is asking, if you were thrust into one of your novels, which one would you hope it was or wasn't, and why?
I'm looking at my novels. Hold on.
I don't know. Like,
yeah, I don't know either. We write horror. That's the problem.
Yeah.
It's a dangerous question.
Yeah, like I said, I already figured I definitely would not have survived Survivor Song. And Cabins, no, I'm not going to that one either. I mean, maybe Disappearance of Devil's Rock, but you know, if I was 13, I think I'd be in trouble too.
Yeah.
I don't know. The novel I'm sort of working on now is sort of purposefully, goofily autobiographical. So I'm trying out the putting myself in a horror novel situation. We'll see what happens. I'm only on page 70, so I don't know.
Yeah, that's a hard question.
Right?
I definitely don't want to be in Flush Boy. Flush Boy is a novel about a kid working the window of his father's drive-through urinal. I don't want to be anywhere in that novel. I think it doesn't smell good in that novel. I think, I know, I want to be in The Bird Is Gone. That's it. It's a novel from 2003, I think. In The Bird Is Gone, through a legal loophole, the Great Plains of America become Indian again. And I think that would be wonderful. It's like a big version of what's happening in Oklahoma right now, you know?
Very true. Sorry, I'm looking through all the questions. Oh, this is fun. Christopher asks, this is another like dig deep. Is there a character you've killed in a story whose death still haunts you?
Yeah. Potential spoiler, but like Wen from Cabin at the End of the World, you know, it's weird. It was hard to do, but it was also like necessary to do. And I would say something similar to maybe a few side characters in Survivor Song. Was both hard and like sort of like was like rubbing my hands to do it. But the character who upset me the most, though, you know, and she lives through the whole book, is Elizabeth from Disappearance of Devil's Rock. I don't know, which is weird to say. Like I don't want to say, I don't know, just like reading that book like in the proof stage, like, you know, it didn't bother me while I was writing it, but like, you know, Stephen knows, you go away from it for a few months because your editors are late getting you the copy on it. Sorry, Jen, I'm not making fun of you. You know, and you read through it again, it was like, yeah, I mean, of anything I've ever written, you know, she sort of affected me like maybe the most sad.
I think for me, it would be a character at the end of Mapping the Interior. I don't want to spoil anything, but there's a character at the end of Mapping the Interior who is probably not going to live through this experience. And when I wrote it, like I felt like this is horror because I should not be doing this. I still feel bad about doing that, you know? But I think that's our job as horror writers. We have to do stuff that, like, you want to just protect your characters and put them in a padded room and keep them safe, you know? But we are in the genre we're in, so there has to be teeth and saw blades and anvils coming out of the sky and starlac pits and everything, you know?
And if I'm going to pick one of Stephen's, from a short story, the Dad and Father, Son, Holy Rabbit, I mean, in that short story, I feel like he took all the awfulness, like all the like dad awfulness of the road and somehow compressed it into like what, a 3,000, 4,000 word short story.
Yeah. Thank you.
Another question from Anna. She says, I love horror novels, but some of the themes are so crazy. How do you get an idea for a horror story?
Man, it's like, how do you stop the ideas from coming for me? You know, like there's so many ideas for horror stories, and it's to me, it's never about the premise. It's never about the idea. It's always about the voice. If I can hear a first line that tells me the angle of entry and the means of the delivery of exposition throughout this novel, then I've got the novel. Then it doesn't matter what happens because I can tell this novel. Like I think my novel, The Long Trial of Nolan Dugatti, the first line is, "What I remember about my father are the suicide notes." And that gave me everything I needed to structure and write that novel. It wrote itself. That was one I did in 3 days for a contest. And I was really lucky to chance upon that voice. But if I don't hear that first line, then the premise is nothing. I've got story ideas are trash. Yeah, for me, there has to be a voice, an angle into the story.
I mean, the essay you wrote about writing that novelette in like 72 or novella in 72 hours is almost as harrowing as the book. So I don't know. I feel like I have to work hard to come up with ideas. I mean, I get little snippets all the time, but I don't know. For me, the fun of like, I don't know. I like taking the genre with everyone's innate imposter syndrome. Like to me, the idea of being part of the horror genre is fun to me. It's like I get to hang out with all these amazing writers and filmmakers, and if I'm nice or if I'm good, they'll let me take little sparks from them and hopefully create something a little bit different. So I don't know. That's what excites me. Like if I have an idea that I think is good, I want to somehow connect that story to other stories. And sometimes in not like obvious ways, but if you're going to work in horror, I mean, why not join in that, like, I don't know, century plus long conversation, like, and maybe if you do your job well enough, like what you wrote about might actually inform some other people's opinions about like an older work, or maybe make you think of it differently if you try something else. So I don't know.
No, I totally agree. It's like we're all just putting bricks in the house of fiction, and sometimes you put a brick that might stay for 10 or 20 years if you're lucky. But it's not about how long something lasts. It's about whether a reader out there feels it, whether they have to leave the light on when they go to bed. That's when you've done something as a horror writer, I think.
Yeah. June asks, for you specifically, Stephen, are there any other Indigenous horror writers or filmmakers that you would recommend?
Jeff Barnaby just did Blood Quantum, which is a zombie novel set on a Canadian reserve, or set in the whole world, but it kind of is focused through a Canadian reserve, and it's just amazing. Everybody should watch Blood Quantum. It's on Shudder right now. I think it's on Shudder, if I remember correctly. Yeah.
Oh. They're all so good. And we're not going to get to all of them, but thank you for that. Matt says, thanks for doing this. What is a genre of fiction that you enjoy that your readers would be surprised by, and what do you recommend in that genre?
I mean, when I grew up, even though I was like a super short, super skinny, if people don't believe me, I say I was super short because my spine was curved and scoliosis. I was, I was like, as recently, well, not that recent now, but when I was a sophomore in high school, I was 5'6.5". So my learner's permit, they put my height on it, and that was on my first license. So at one point I was like this height with my license saying I was 5'6.5". So I was always paranoid that, I was going to get pulled over and they were going to think it's not mine. Anyway, what the hell was I saying? What was the question again? I just totally threw myself.
Fiction, a genre outside of horror. Yeah.
So anyway, I spent so much of my afternoons, like from school, I didn't have a ton of friends, and I would just sit in my backyard and shoot hoops all day. I would try for records, keep track, imagining that, that I was, Larry Bird or something. So consequently, I am a sports fan, and I like to read occasionally, like sport biographies if they're interesting, or sometimes sports fiction if it's good. One of the questions I was going to ask Stephen, because he's done basketball a couple of times in his books, and I don't know if I've told him, but I thought he did a really good job. Someone who's played a lot of basketball. That's always my fear as a writer, because I always judge sports books. I'm like, that sucks. That's not what basketball is like, or this other sport. And Stephen did a good job with it. So I've always been afraid to put basketball and stuff. I guess one book I would recommend, though, that is, even though it's not basketball, it's David Peace, who's a wonderful British crime writer. But he wrote like a fictionalized account of a British football manager's like 50 days at a club, because he got fired after 50 days. And it's called The Damned United. It's actually, it's just really fun, really well written.
All right. For me, I guess the genre that I'm not supposed to like is romantic comedies, but I love romantic comedies. Really, I think romantic comedies and horror are built on the same beats. Just they are expressed. One is with like goofiness and hearts, and the other is with blood and gore. You know, but the same way Paul was saying, the joke is basically like the joke in comedy is just how you build tension in horror with the punchline, the release of tension, and all that stuff. I think rom-coms in horror are built very, very similarly. They're just flip sides of each other. But as for reading, you know, what I read the most, probably even more than fiction, is paleoanthropology. I'm forever lost in Neanderthals and just look like just minute analyses of cave paintings and different interpretations of what this bone or this tool might have meant. And I read that stuff compulsively. That's my happy place, is paleoanthropology.
Absolutely. There are a lot of really good trailers on Facebook where people rehash horror into rom-com and vice versa.
Yeah.
Really?
Like,
Oh,
yeah,
wow.
if you look it up, it's very fun.
Yeah, the Shining one is probably the shining example, no pun intended.
Yeah.
But,
it's very fun. Highly recommended.
Nice.
Yeah, because I think you're so correct in the beats that are so similar and the anticipation that both build you. We're going to ask one more question, kind of general, another thing to kind of think about. If you're going to recommend a horror book to someone, just one, maybe to get them started, or one that really made it for you, what would that book be?
And
we probably can't recommend each other's.
Go for it.
Oh, man,
No,
it's so hard.
Yeah, no, I'll try.
Stephen gets to go first on this one.
Okay, I'll go first. One horror book to rule them all, or not rule them all, but to serve as an on-ramp to all. I would say, how about, one novel that I love, I've read it a lot of times already, is Gemma Files' experimental film. I think that it processes forward exactly as horror should process forward. It's got the right stakes, it's got the right pacing, it covers a lot of ground, it's scary, it makes you worried about the world, and it's contemporary too. My concern sometimes is if I give someone a book from 50 years ago, that they'll be turned off because it was a different mode of fiction, or they don't drive cars like that anymore or whatever. And I'd hate for somebody not to read horror because of that, And so that's why I'm dialing it contemporary, and also because it's an amazing novel.
I'm gonna, since I made him go first, I'm gonna cheat and do two really quickly. Well, one is Haunting of Hill House. It's hard not to. I mean, that book is still, like, talk about comedy and horror. It's just so funny and smart and still scary, but a little bit more recent. But even then, it was late 70s, early 80s. But Peter Straub's Ghost Story, when he was talking about how experimental film has everything, I kind of feel like Peter Straub's Ghost Story has everything in it as well.
Yeah. I feel like his Shadowland has everything in it. I love that book. I so love that book. And with The Haunting of Hill House, I always feel like if we'd have read it back then, that those jokes would have landed in a different way. Because I always feel like, and I don't have any research, proof for this, I always feel like Shirley Jackson was responding to a gothic frenzy in a way that we've lost touch with, So I think her all the shrill conversations they have, I always feel like she's parodying something that I'm not quite in touch with,
Yeah, but even when Montague's wife shows up and she brings this random headmaster dude, I mean, that stuff is hilarious.
Yeah. Oh, I know it is. It's like on Star Trek Next Generation, when Troy's mom would bring her ginormous butler with her, Yeah.
Yeah. I just started watching Voyager.
Yeah, Voyager's so good.
So, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I love that. A lot of people in our chat are also big Shirley Jackson fans, so I think that resounds with a lot of people. I have a final question for you before we wrap up the evening. It's somehow been an hour already. But for each of you, and again, if you were to take a moment to reflect, what from each of your new books, both Survivor Song and The Only Good Indian, are you hoping people what do you hope they're taking away from your novel? What are they thinking about a week later after they read it?
I guess I'll jump in. I hope that what they're thinking about is what they have done in the past that could possibly have kickstarted a justice cycle. And I would hope that that influences the way they move through the world now. I would hope it would influence them to move through the world in a more responsible, compassionate manner. You know, because if there was a Jason who would rise in all of our back trails, I think we would act better. You know.
Yeah.
We should have let me go first, because we could have ended on that. So I don't know, it's weird because, I wrote the book before the pandemic hit. So now, the smallest problem in the world, that this book will never be read out of that context. But I would say, my novel, The Cabin at the End of the World in my head is connected to this, because that novel was about the horror and hope of choosing to go on. This book to me was the step after that. This book to me was the horror and hope within they're both intertwined within the act of survival. So I do hope, especially now, that people do take some sort of measure of hope from the book. I mentioned the punk songs earlier. To me, what horror and punk are connected by is the idea that there is this sort of, even though it seems weird to people, that there is this hope, because I feel like both punk and horror, there's a reveal of a terrible truth, but to me, there is hope in that shared recognition that we recognize that something is terribly wrong. There's value in that.
Yeah,
something like that.
There absolutely is.
Nice.
So everyone, fight for justice. Have hope. You can purchase copies, if you don't have them already, of Survivor Song and The Only Good Indian from Strand. The copies we have will have book plates from both of you that are signed, so you can get some signatures, which is awesome. The links are in this chat. If you scroll back to the beginning of it, they're also just on the website. So please read horror. They're both wonderful books, especially in the summer, especially in the time period we're in. Read something that is a little bit worse than what the present day is. Thank you all for tuning in, Stephen and Paul. Thank you both for talking with me. This has been really enjoyable.
Thank you, Andrea.
Yeah, is there anyone that you guys want to thank while we're here, or say hi to?
You for moderating it so well. For one.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you. I say hi, Larissa. I saw her popping up on the on the chat a couple times.
Yeah.
Wonderful. So I guess thank you again, and then to everyone, have a great night.